able to join us or
I
not?
haven't heard from Cam.
Is Cam in today, John, you know?
He's here, I'm not sure what.
Which sections?
The whole bill, other than Chip.
Okay, you're live now.
I think Ellen's municipal.
Yeah, but
Appeals.
it's that, right, and that she's the appeals. Oh, and, right. Yeah, well, we know what happened with that, so I can update us on that. Great, welcome. It's Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs. It is Tuesday, May 27th, and the House has just passed on third reading S-127, which includes quite a few changes to the CHIP proposal that we sent them, the Community Housing Infrastructure Program, and they have also done some additional work on appeals. So we need to get updated on those and see what we may present as an amendment, possibly to see if we can move and come to some agreement with the House. So, John, we welcome you fresh from the House and fresh from the final landing spot of where Chip left the House.
Sounds good. Afternoon, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. There we go. So I was having a hard time getting into the Zoom, but I think I'm headed down there now.
See you now.
Yep. And I think what I'll do, just given time constraints, I can show you the.
If you just, you know, show us review, but if you just like walk us through the key differences as
Sure.
you see them now, that I think would be helpful. I think we can keep it pretty big picture at the moment.
For sure.
And just go, great.
Okay, so I will.
Does that make it a little easier?
Yep. So one thing to note, I don't think this will be controversial, but the definition of housing development includes renovation and rehabilitation. So just something to know is a difference here. Not just new construction, but would include rehabilitation as well.
And
Can we get copies of this?
So what I can share. I
Yeah,
can
could you
with
share the screen? I have no idea.
Yep, what I
Where
can
that
share with you is the amendment that was offered by Representative Kimball and others, which is where the House landed.
this is what got passed.
So this will just be
Was this a floor amendment or a Ways and Means?
floor
It's a-
amendment. This came after.
This was offered by Mahaly, Marcotte, and Kimball, as I recall. Is that right?
You've got Kimball, you got Edie Granning, Kornheiser, Marcotte, Mahaly. So, the screen is so small, it's gonna be hard for me to have a bunch of windows up, but I will do my best to walk through these. So
Are these the only changes?
this is all I'm able to speak to are the CHIP section. So this amendment is the entirety of everything that speaks to CHIP.
Okay, that's all.
So this takes out all of the S-127 CHIP provisions and
Okay.
replaces it entirely
Okay,
with
that's
what
all
is
I
here.
need to know.
Yep. And so the first thing I was noting here is this definition of housing development.
Mhm.
Just note that they've added rehabilitation or renovation, so that if you were taking a building and turning it into a habitable place, if previously wasn't a habitable place, that could be a permissible use of tax financing under this case.
So, okay, so it just broadens what TIF can be used for.
By quite a bit, and
Is
we
that
already have the VHIP
project
program.
raised?
I'm not clear how they felt the VHIP program wasn't adequate for that.
I'm not sure.
So they added rehabilitation and renovation.
It's not a trigger, in other words. It's not saying this triggers some
Nope.
covenant or something.
No. This is just saying, so housing development is what occurs
Yeah.
on the housing development site. It's what you're
Okay.
trying to stimulate with the infrastructural improvements that you're making. And
Okay,
so they were saying, well, not just new construction, but if you could use this to turn a warehouse into an apartment, that could be a usable thing.
it didn't say new construction before, but I think they just
Totally. And so
overwrought this.
part of why I said it really lightly,
Mhm.
because I would not expect you guys to object to this, but maybe I just don't.
Oh, okay.
However, I will come to something where I could see there could be objections, which is the definition of improvements.
Okay,
So just to remind you guys of what was in y'all's definition, which aligned with how it's done for TIF districts, you provide a broad bucket you say infrastructural improvements, and then you provide a non-exhaustive list of things that constitute infrastructure. And this is what you're financing with TIP. What is in this, what the House has, is not a non-exhaustive list. It is an exhaustive list of permissible kinds of infrastructure which you could finance. If you don't see it here, it is not covered. So what you see is the same lead-in as the Senate had, any of the following that will serve a public good and fulfill the purpose of the subchapter. But then you have the installation or construction of wastewater, stormwater, water dispersal, water collection, public roads, streets, bridges, traffic signals, street and sidewalk lighting, etc., and then digital or telecommunications infrastructure. The thing to note is, I'll just keep saying it, this is exhaustive. If it's not here, it is not coverable with tax increment financing through CHIP, which is a very different approach from what you guys did, which is just to provide a broad bucket, right? It's infrastructural improvements, and then you set out a non-exhaustive list.
Multimodal facilities means parking?
It would be, I think it's only contemplated if it's multiple transit options available. So there was a specific choice not to use parking garages. So I would say that is not, if you just have a literal parking garage, that would not be included in here. So I would expect improvements to be something you would want to focus on and think about this.
I definitely think we want to do that, partly because we're talking about communities that each town has to decide what infrastructure is needed
Right.
in order to build housing. To be this prescriptive about it at this point, when we're trying to make this flexible and used by a number of communities, a number of different communities.
Mhm.
So can we pause to say that we think we just take this out?
I think this is a possible thing to take out, or just to go back to our original.
Yeah, you would need to replace it with the original.
This is my first star.
I came in late. Is this online? Because I don't see the.
What
It
I am
just got passed an hour.
Yeah, what I am sharing is just Representative Kimball's amendment, so you could find it in the calendar, but you wouldn't find it in this form. I did
It's
share
in the
with,
House calendar under S one
I
twenty-seven.
just posted it to the committee page
Thank you.
and asked for it to be printed.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I would say this is our first star, which is,
definition of improvements, yeah. Okay, next piece is we can jump to, I'm sure you've heard about the cap.
yep,
So there's a proposed cap on how much can be approved within a year. And this definition you see at the bottom of the page,
how much
like
what can be approved.
education property tax increment retention.
Mm-hmm.
And this definition that you see, starting on line 17 of page 3, is tied to that cap. So lifetime education property tax increment retention is the total education property tax increment to be retained for a project across its lifetime. So add up in each year the revenues that are expected to be generated from the additional property value that is generated in the site, and then apply a percentage, right? Because you're only retaining a particular percentage of the increment generated there. This is your lifetime education property tax increment retention for a project. And so the cap that you'll see later is aggregated across all applicants within a year. How much can VEPC approve in this education property tax increment retention for that year? It's a $40 million figure, which we'll come to that.
40 million,
per
per
year in aggregate lifetime. And
so 40 million,
You say aggregate lifetime, so cumulative over the years?
so what it is the aggregate is all applicants within the year. That's why we use aggregate. And lifetime is per project across its 20-year retention period, how much education property tax increment is expected to be retained. So for each project, you're getting the full amount that is not going to the ed fund for that project. And then you're aggregating across all applicants in a year. This is a way of getting at how much would not be going to the ed fund across all the projects approved within a particular year.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
Number one, did JFO and Ledge Council work in some sort of intellectual way to arrive at 40 million?
So the modeling that, obviously I did not create, the figure JFO produced with modeling to get at what would be expected to produce a maximal yearly impact on the ed fund with some basic assumptions in place of 14 million. Otherwise, meaning
1.4 as opposed to 4.0.
14 in a year on the ed fund. And what that would mean is a 1 cent increase on the homestead property tax rate. So that's where they came at the figure, was that 40 million aggregate lifetime is expected to produce a maximal yearly impact of 1 cent on your homestead rate. So that's where the number comes from.
That's if you agree with their whole No.
And I think if you ask them about this figure, they will be able to show evidence from TIF districts to show that these figures haven't even been hit for TIF districts. So I don't know that
That
you're
was-
likely to hit this cap, but that's not a question for me.
But that should almost speak to making it less prescriptive, because Betsy does a pretty good job making sure. It's
Absolutely.
limited.
Betsy
So you're
screens all
saying-
these to a T.
TIF
Right.
our regular TIF program doesn't contemplate a cap. It's just capped at the number of municipalities that can.
We
The
have
cap
capped
that
it
it-
by numbers of municipalities, not by money.
If the cap is based on, counties and how many
Mhm.
districts can be in the
Right.
state, whereas here, you could have infinite projects
Right.
across the state, but there's gonna be a money.
But that's a really important difference, because, for those of us who've been on finance recently, the cost of a penny on the property tax has gone up like $2 or more million each year for the past few
It
years.
used to be
like-
10 and now it's 14.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it'll change. So this is a silly measure
I think,
with inflation.
so this is a question mark. So this is one of the areas of this, let's flag this area.
And just for you guys I guess you guys will have to run it one as well, but I do have to run it one, so just
Mhm.
making sure. Okay, let's talk about.
Sorry, what did you mean about one?
You have to leave
At
it.
1 p.m.
Finance.
Oh, yes, and we have two other people that have to leave at 1.
12:45.
You have to leave
We
at
have to
12
leave at 12:45
Let's,
for what?
for houses,
For what?
for caucus.
Oh, you're having a caucus before finance?
Before finance.
Caucuses usually do take a bit of a backseat to committee meetings if
Right.
we're in the last
Okay.
week of session. I'm just saying,
Giving you a
like,
heads up, we got
I appreciate, we're
all
also,
afternoon, all morning.
excuse me, we're also meeting tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock to go through this and discuss this further. We're not gonna come up with a perfect amendment in 15 minutes.
okay,
So, right.
so maybe I can,
I think we just really need to be clear on the differences so that we can begin to think about what our path is.
yep, so affordability construct here. That's what you're seeing on page 4, mixed income housing and mixed income housing development. Mixed income housing is housing subject to a housing subsidy covenant of perpetual duration. What I would note here is this isn't prescriptive as to a particular income level. You can craft these housing subsidy covenants to target different income levels. So if your municipality wanted to be targeting low income households, you could do that. You could also use this to target middle income households.
You're welcome.
So you can use this housing subsidy covenant to target different income groups. It's flexible in that sense, but note that it is of perpetual duration. So this is an attempt to get at a permanent affordability construct. And then a mixed income housing development is a housing development of which at least 20% of the units are those mixed income housing units. The way that the affordability piece is built into this concept is not a requirement for all projects that come through. It is part of an incentive structure. So if you meet this
Sorry,
definition,
perpetual affordability is part of an incentive structure.
yes,
yeah, both of these rewrite the definition of what else, anything else we would see on housing.
yeah, this doesn't use like Title 24 affordable housing, but this is, you could use this in different ways across different municipalities to get at different income groups. The thing I would flag here is perpetual duration, right? This is permanent, and this is part of an incentive structure. So you don't have to have this to get through CHIP, but you get an extra 20% statewide education property tax increment retention if you do meet this criteria. So it'll be 60% versus 80%.
But that's
So the 20% comes from lowering.
exactly,
Okay,
there's two different ways you could say that.
Yep.
thank you. So this is a flag too.
The next piece I would jump to is the purpose section, and I will just,
What page are you on with the purpose section?
page 5.
Okay.
So what you guys had is the purpose of housing infrastructure tax increment financing is to provide revenues for improvements and related costs to encourage the development of primary residences for households of low or moderate income. And you see something similar here, but purpose of the pilot, because there is a sunset proposed, purpose of the pilot program is to encourage the development of new primary residences for households of low and moderate income. And then they've added this across both rural and urban areas of all Vermont counties that would not be created but for the infrastructure improvements funded by the program. I did have some folks flag this, but for this included in the purpose. Obviously,
It's got a different meaning from the but for later on.
Exactly. It comes from the
So I
same
don't see where
thing.
you are, sorry, I'm just lost. Are you on line 16, 17, beyond that?
Just 8 through 12 on page 5. So-
Right, I saw that, and then, okay, right. Got it.
Mhm.
There's the buffer, got it.
The real, something change here is adding pilot and then across both rural and urban areas of all Vermont counties. And the way that this matters is, there's some places where purpose is brought into the program, determinations have to be made, like in your housing development plan. But maybe most importantly, with a cap included, Betsy is tasked with conducting rulemaking to come up with a prioritization metric for dealing with applicants as they come in. And so one of the things they would look to is the purpose of the program. And as you can see here, by having a purpose that calls out across both rural and urban areas, that means that when they develop this prioritization mechanism, they would need to think about that CHIP is meant to be made available across the state. So it's not merely rhetorical is my point. The purpose section does have effects.
So did this leave here, this committee with line 10, low and moderate income, as opposed to general housing or economic development? Did it leave here like this,
Yep,
or was it changed?
This, the way it left was encourage the development of primary residences for households of low or moderate income.
Okay, thanks.
But we
So
didn't say pilot, and we didn't
But
say
we
rural.
didn't.
I got a bit of a speed bump there as, not a surprise.
Right,
CHIP should be an economic tool, not just a low-income housing tool.
Right, it should be a tool for all housing.
Yes.
well,
And economic development.
yeah, I mean, I think this is all a problem if you sunset the entire other TIF program, which I think this bill does for a pilot.
We'll come to that.
Let's
On
keep
housing,
going, because
so.
I appreciate that we're losing 2 members in 10 minutes.
So section 1908, I do want to flag something here that has surprisingly not been brought up a lot, which is on line 19. You can't see it, but I'll just read out what it says. This is telling you what the housing development site is. So starting on 17, which shall consist of the parcel or parcels on which a housing development is installed or constructed. As it left the Senate, this was your housing development site is where the construction of the housing development occurs and any immediately contiguous parcels. That is not here. That's been removed in the House proposal. So your housing development site is smaller in the House proposal. It would just be where the construction occurs and not the immediately contiguous parcels. So this is where that would be. You would have a clause here that says, and any immediately contiguous parcels. So just want to flag that the housing development site is differently sized.
And the infrastructure, they're envisioning it only affecting that immediate.
No.
They
So the
could be
infrastructure
larger.
can be separate from the
Okay.
housing development. This is just, you need to think about this from the perspective of, this is where your OTV is set. This is where your increment is generated. So the size of the site affects the amount of increment that you're going to have available to finance infrastructure.
And neighboring sites benefit a lot from this infrastructure, so you want to include them.
As where you could generate more increment and, So this will be a smaller increment generated.
Got it, smaller increments to
Yep.
go to paying them, yeah.
Did you say contiguous? I'm not seeing that.
It's not there.
We
They
had-
took
Exactly.
out,
They took it out.
they took out our
Just that one
contiguous
parcel.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the neighboring or contiguous parcels will greatly benefit from this infrastructure, their taxable value will also
Okay.
increase, thus creating more increment to make these projects pencil out.
The next place I will jump is, we're talking about, these are the steps that the municipality has to do to create these projects. They have to develop a housing development plan. Another thing you're not gonna see here, so I'm calling out, in this case, it actually is, I try to call out things you won't see and things that you will see. So what was added is on line 14, a determination that the proposed housing development furthers the purpose of the subchapter. I mentioned before that the changes to the purpose section weren't merely rhetorical, but actually have substantive effects on the applications. This is one way. In your housing development plan, if you're a municipality, you have to include as part of that plan a determination that the proposed housing development furthers the purpose of the subchapter, which is what we just talked about, that purpose. So,
Can I ask a question?
yes.
You said that will trigger Betsy to have to go into rulemaking. I would have expected them to have to go into rulemaking anyway.
sorry, I might have misspoken. Betsy has broad rulemaking authorization, and one thing that they are specifically tasked with doing they have to do, not just they're authorized to do, is develop prioritization mechanisms for dealing with the fact that you have a cap. Otherwise, you might just have a run on projects, right? First in the door becomes the first to actually receive it. So they have to develop a prioritization mechanism, and when they do that, they need to think about the purpose of the subchapter as that's basically it.
Okay.
Other changes worth noting in section 1909 on page 7. This is your housing infrastructure agreement, and I know that you guys have heard lots about this. Subdivision 4. So we're talking about the agreement that has to be in place between municipality, developer, potentially third-party sponsor. What minimum safeguards do they need to meet? And what you see newly added by the House, they need to provide terms and sufficient remedies, or if the municipality so elects, an ordinance to ensure that any housing unit within the housing development be offered exclusively as a bona fide domicile in perpetuity. The simple way to put this is perpetual primary residence requirement. But there's a couple of things to note. This isn't prescriptive as to the specific means by which this is achieved. I think what people think is likely to happen is covenants deed restrictions, so that you would have to offer this exclusively as a primary residence. But the part I would note is it's about offering, right? Someone might move in and then they move to Florida 3 years later. They're not dinging this thing, right? The restriction is that it be offered exclusively as that domicile in perpetuity.
It's in perpetuity.
Yes.
I just think we should stick with the facts of the language, and I think the way you represented it, I don't think it's accurate, unfortunately, to the words on the page.
Well, I think all of us want these to be full-time residences. I don't think
Well,
anybody.
we do, but making a municipality check if they're a bona fide domicile into perpetuity, we
It's a
don't do
lot.
that anywhere else in housing policy.
It is a total burden. This is an important flag because this is an additional burden. What we have been trying to do is make this simpler for smaller towns or a whole range of towns.
It says
to develop
offered
that.
exclusively, so I just feel like if you went to Florida and put this on Airbnb, the auditor could ding the municipality for that property being on Airbnb, which is a problem.
What I mean to say is that it's about the offering exclusively. So you're going to be reliant on the assertions of the purchasing party, right? They're saying this is going to be my primary residence or bona fide domicile.
So you could also very simply say that any project that is financed in CHIP has to be a full-time residence. I don't think.
Well, that is, effective. This is a way of building it in
Making
through covenants so that you don't have to have an enforcement mechanism where towns monitor this. And the way that you would envision this happening is HOA or neighbors enforcing this particular covenant, right? So I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying from an administrative standpoint, the thinking of including here is to avoid exactly the problems people are identifying with future enforcement. It doesn't require a town to go out and monitor the way that that someone's living on that basis. It's about whether they offer it exclusively to someone as a primary residence in perpetuity. So each person who sells is offering
We
it
have
to
an
someone
extra 10.
to purchase as a primary residence.
We have an extra 10 minutes, good.
And I can keep going.
Yes,
I gather that this is one.
And then we
that
have Ellen has arrived and we have some of the other changes we'll discuss.
So, section 1910, and I'm on page 8 now. This is your application process, so the hoops that an applicant needs to jump through to get access to the program. What you see in subsection B, the but-for test. So this is newly added here. This is the same but-for test as is included for TIP districts, just using some updated defined terms specific to CHIP. So building in but-for test for CHIP.
Okay.
This is a critical piece, if we could have a second, where, okay,
This is one of the many critical pieces. But this is exactly the same as what currently exists for bigger TIFs, for TIFs.
Yes, yes.
not number 1.
Sorry, this is exactly the same. The only differences are using defined terms specific to this. So this is the same but-for test as TIP districts.
You mean 1, 2, and 3?
Yes.
But they say housing development instead of municipal project?
Infrastructure.
Yeah, I can pull up the statute, improvements, infrastructural improvements.
because number 2 certainly wouldn't be the same, units of mixed income housing without, I don't even understand what that means.
So the concept under 2 is just how would the stimulated development differ if you didn't have the tax income financing available? And one of the ways
Well,
you could
it's like
identify.
in the number of units.
Yes, right, like, oh, it might cost more, you might have a longer period of construction, right, if you didn't have access to this tax increment financing, in
Right.
which case you might have to shrink the size of it.
But Pepsi goes through this as they consider and weigh every project, correct? I mean,
And there were 2 definitions of mixed income housing.
before they're even approved.
But this was meant to be a smaller type project without as much administrative overhead. So if we put this administrative overhead on all these smaller projects, it effectively neuters the entire intent of this program.
I don't disagree. And also, I mean, one either has faith in Betsy's ability to screen and appreciate what each community is capable of and what is possible. Anyway.
I mean,
so
not
this is
only
one of
that,
our
but
big flags.
If we can't understand what's being asked for, I don't know how we could expect other people to understand what's being asked for. This is,
Okay, so well, given our time frame, we have another 5 minutes.
but do you, I mean,
Five
do
of
you,
five? 5 of,
5 of,
okay.
do you
great.
understand, Madam Chair, what number 2 is asking for? Because this
No,
is important, like, if we don't understand, I don't know
I
that we can go to
dis-
conference and.
I don't disagree that we need, how is, because there are 3 here. So the first one is,
I mean, 1 and 3 look familiar,
yeah,
but 2 is new and I cannot even understand what they want.
So I have up on the screen what we have for TIF districts, which is how the proposed development components and size would differ, if at all, including if applicable to development in the number of units of affordable housing without the education property tax increment. Here's what we have in the amendment.
But that's if you're doing affordable housing.
Mhm.
So the units of affordable housing has a definition.
Yes,
This is a new made-up definition of mixed income housing, in which there's 2 definitions. And then it's saying the number of units.
Yep.
So those are big differences, is all I'm saying. I just don't want us to gloss over this as like, oh, this is exactly what's in TIF. Those are
no,
very
this is
different.
new.
This is
not in
very different housing policy.
it may be different housing policy, it is the same but-for test. That's what I would say. Instead of using affordable housing, it uses the affordable construct for CHIP, which is mixed income housing, which does have a definition specific to here. Yes.
Okay.
Project criterion, I'll jump down to page 10. As-
I'm just worried that like,
No, this is.
there's a lot of people in the house who might not even know what they did if it's being described this way, as like, it's just simple and it's the same thing. Like, I'm just a little worried right
This-
now.
Okay, well, let's just keep moving so that we can at least get a sense of the scope of the number of differences that we need to address.
So the project criterion, we're talking about how much housing, how much is dedicated to housing within the development. As left the Senate, this was that the projected housing development include housing, right? We didn't land on a specific floor area. What you have here is Betsy to review a municipality's housing infrastructure project application to determine whether at least 65% of the floor area of the projected housing development is dedicated to housing. So 65% of floor area.
Because I believe we felt that all housing, and we ended up, we had long discussions on whether or not to.
Well, floor area is just bad housing policy because you
Yeah.
can create tiny units and luxury units. It's a bad idea to. Housing policy people did not write this. That's what I would say. There is one person on this amendment who's on the housing committee, and this is not good housing policy.
Agreed.
The next thing to note is something you won't see. There's no location criteria. So you can pursue CHIP projects anywhere in the state. You don't have to fall within a particular area.
I like that.
So the other project criteria are similar. No, they're quite different.
Did you hear that? This can go anywhere. There's no location
Yes,
criteria.
after
Yes.
much discussion,
Yeah,
after much
Nobody will
discussion,
qualify
they.
for it.
right,
They
great.
took
But what a
away.
give, you know?
And the other key I mean, there are quite a few additional changes here under the project criteria.
There's just the one, it's just one project criterion, right? It was either that, as passed the Senate, include housing, and here it's at least 65% of the floor area dedicated to housing.
We were floating 25%, 50%. We never
Yep.
did a 65.
No, we never do. So we have mixed income criterion is the next one.
Mixed income, again, this is part of an incentive structure. This is not something that you have to meet as any applicant for this program. This is if you want that extra 20% increment.
It's if you don't want to get 20% deducted. I really think we should be saying it that way, because it didn't leave here at 60%. So this is a penalty.
Yes,
You guys can
you
frame it
could view
however
it
you
that
want.
way.
Yeah.
I know, but I just, it's really important how we talk about this.
It is important, and it's also, I don't believe we apply this in any other TIF.
No,
But this is a completely new.
this is a penalty for building housing that's not perpetually affordable and monitored by the domicile, by the municipality as a permanently owner-occupied domicile. That's really different, John, than what you're saying, unfortunately. That's my problem.
It is not different than what I'm saying, but you guys can politically message it how you would like. You get a different increment based on if you access the mixed income criteria.
No, that's
This is the
fair, that's
Senate,
fair,
this
that's
is the
fair.
Senate, and you should be expressing this as changes to what our intent was.
When,
He is expressing it as he has written it.
When we
So
get
we can interpret it as we want.
and when we get to the retention, I can draw out the 60 versus 80. I mean,
Yeah.
it's easy to specify it there. So no location criteria, mixed income criterion. This is part of that incentive structure, and the way that you access this is whether your projected housing development is a mixed income housing development, which again, that's that 20% of units are mixed income housing units. One thing to note here that is different than, for instance, the definition of affordable housing development that we have in Title 24. There we have a 20% or 5 units, whichever is greater. There is no minimum unit for mixed income housing. It's just that 20% needs to be dedicated. So theoretically, you could have a smaller development that accesses the mixed income piece.
So
Does that make sense?
whichever is lower.
For the mixed income piece, it would just be that 20% of the units. For affordable housing development, we have the greater of 20% or 5 units, meaning that if you were a
The
5-unit
greater of.
building, you would have to have all of those units made affordable housing to access as affordable housing development. You don't have to do that here. You just have to have 20% of your development be dedicated to mixed income housing here. So not having the 5-unit minimum is slightly more flexible, is what I would say. But in any case, this is part of that incentive structure.
What I keep having to do is, now you say mixed income criterion, but you have two definitions of mixed income. You have mixed income housing and mixed income housing development.
So the reason there's 2 terms there are mixed income housing is used to identify what is actually targeting someone at a lower income level, right? And then you have a development specific definition because you need to call out how much of that development is dedicated to that, right? So we have the same concept in Title 24 for affordable housing where we say, here's what affordable housing is. It targets incomes in these levels. And then an affordable housing development is a development of which at least 20% or 5 units, whichever is greater, are affordable housing units. So you need both. They're not conflicting definitions. It's just a way of building in how many of the units in a development should be dedicated to this kind of housing.
Got it, let's keep going.
The tax increment financing plan, this is much the same as left the Senate. The piece that I would add here, although this would be implicit in the tax increment financing plan, on page 11.
You skipped to something I really wanted to ask about. So on F, does this require a public vote for all of these project-based debts?
No, just to pledge the credit of the municipality.
So it says prior to public vote,
So that does not require a public vote on each of these.
Including if the sponsor is a municipality, prior to a public vote to pledge the credit of the municipality under section 1910A. So only, right, you do have to have a tax increment financing plan for all projects, right? That's not unique to those that are using a muni as a sponsor. But for this piece related to a public vote, this is just talking about, you need to provide this information to the public if the muni is bonding for this project, right? If the muni isn't bonding, they're still gonna see the tax increment financing plan. Yep, but you don't have to, this doesn't change the structure of other sponsors being available. Yep. The piece I was gonna say is added to the plan is on page 11, where we say the resulting tax increments in each year of the financial plan, so how much tax increment.
Number 4.
Yep. We've added and the lifetime education property tax increment retention, which is that concept that's built in to get at the cap, right? This is talking
Yeah,
about
it's-
for that project, how much education property tax increment is envisioned to be retained across its 20-year retention period. That way, BEPC has this figure for purposes of determining the cap, if you're hitting the cap. So basically, whatever you do with the cap will need to affect this section, subdivision 4.
Got it.
Um,
And it's really a whole new concept of caps.
It is a different, different approach to cap. Page 11, you have this subsection G approval. Some of this is new, but it kind of rides on the rest of the section. So I would say that this is an outcome of whatever you choose to do with the section. BEPC shall approve or deny an application not later than 45 days following receipt of the completed application. So that deadline is new, adding a 45-day application deadline or review deadline, and can only approve applications that meet all the requirements of the subsection other than the mixed income rate, because that's purely for purposes of the incentive structure.
It's not giving them an option to continue communication with the applicant to get more information.
I don't think it upsets that unless you just mean that they have to respond within 45 days.
It does
which I could-
upset that, I think. How does it not? It says shall approve or deny.
Yeah, that's why I was trying to clarify. If you just meant they literally have the 45 days to do it and then it's over, that is correct. This is a 45-day deadline. I don't think that means you couldn't ask for someone to revise things and resubmit, right? But this is saying,
That has to be done in 45 days.
but the BEPC's review would be within 45 days.
But the approval or denial would be in 45 days.
Yes, that's
Right, that's what it says, but
So even if you had a back and forth about you're missing this, that would all have to be done in enough time to give an approval or a denial within 45 days.
To be clear, it's
we will
receipt of a
continue
completed
this tomorrow at
application.
9.
So if there's
Unless
a bunch of back
we
and
have
forth
break
as to
an
you haven't
action,
completed your application, that
That
doesn't
doesn't
trigger.
say that.
We're out of time and we're on page 11, and I definitely don't concur with this, but you don't think we should do a committee
I
conference?
think we're gonna one option is for us to send back an amendment. I think that could be lengthy also, back and forth. So one option is to, concur with further proposal, not concur, but, I mean, to do a further proposal amendment, and one is to not concur and set up a committee of conference. So, I think unless we have an opportunity a little later in the day, because they haven't finished their housing bill. So the hope was we were gonna go back on the floor at 2.
Who has not finished their housing?
They finished 127, yeah.
They did, I mean, the education bill. The
Oh,
hope was to go back on the floor at 2, set up the conference committee for housing, for, education. And,
we can come back here.
yeah, so I think if we could hang loose and communicate and maybe come back and continue this work depending on what the floor action is, that would be great. Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, just reach out, whenever, and I,
Great,
see what my.
thank you. I think,
You didn't have any plans this week, did you, John?
nobody did
Are we
get.
going on fly?
See.
Let's, thank you.